Probably the takeaway I have from the Blocksize War is that before that whole occurrence, the power of miners was often stressed. Even when Satoshi would talk about the network, he would talk about having the majority of miners be honest, and all this. And of course, proof of work is a core piece of Bitcoin. And I think what the Blocksize War did was show that it's not quite that simple. And that basically, even if the majority of miners are in favor of a change, if it's very unpopular among users and node runners, they're not necessarily going to be successful at that change. And there's pushback that can be done or can be threatened against miners that are acting against the will of the broader network. One of the views I have is that the biggest single stakeholder at the end of the day would probably be investors. That they can ultimately decide between the success of a hard fork or not, especially when it comes to kind of a network becoming large and successful. But nodes are a huge piece of the puzzle in terms of how it's a network. That's the network effect in place. That's the whole verification. That's kind of why we're here at the end of the day. Is the fact that instead of money systems operating on one big central node like they do today, Fedwire is basically one big node, and there's any other big settlement or any is just one giant node. Any sort of central bank is a big node, and then banks serve as like smaller subnodes on them that is entirely permissioned asset. And the cool thing about Bitcoin is that it's open source and multiple people can run nodes. And so there's multiple sources of power for economic nodes, but then there's also direct participation from smaller node runners.